All right. Way back in 2000 or 1990s. The history of the submarine begins in the 1990s. And back then it was Project UBAT 2000, because this was going to be the 2000s submarine for Sweden. Back then it was called Project Flundren. I'm not sure what Flundren means. I imagine it's a Swedish word or something. And this is the Kockums Tyson Group brochure that came out, I think it was after the 2000s. I have a copy of this brochure that I will make available on the Patreon side under photos that accompanies this subbrief. So you guys can browse through this very short projection of what the shipyard, or Sweden owns the shipyard, by the way. It's like a nationalized shipyard, right? Anyway, how they're presenting this new future submarine. It's pretty interesting to see what this brochure says they're going to build to what is actually being built now. Just know that whenever you look at this brochure, this is like a sales pitch. Okay, this isn't the actual design. But let's go back to the 1990s. There was a young sonarman putting on his headphones for the first time around this time when all this was beginning, and his name was Aaron. See, funding was halted after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union collapsed, technically Christmas Day, 1991, but the collapse had kind of begun in 1989. Fall of the Berlin Wall, that was a big deal. And then even though the Christmas Day, end of the Soviet Union was official, the ramifications of that weren't clear until like 1992, even a little bit into 1993, when the whole country of the Soviet Union was in disarray. But one thing was for sure, they didn't start a nuclear war. Nuclear warheads weren't going missing. So the early 1990s was a time of great positive thinking, especially here in the United States and in NATO. It was like, wow, we won. We don't have anyone to fight anymore. What's NATO's purpose? And like American military funding got slashed, big time. And we were more, So the same thing happened over in Sweden. They slashed a lot of military funding as well, and the A-26 was on the chopping block because it was early in the design phase. It made sense to not continue funding this because there was no longer really a reason for it in the 1990s. This is all going to change, but that was the thinking back then. So let's go through to 2001. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark come together. And there were early reports of this happening in 2000, but in 2001, it was kind of formal that these three countries would come together and build a new class of submarine called the Viking. And the Viking is basically the A-26 of the 1990s. But they were going to share the cost of development and construction between these three countries. Finland, later on, wasn't going to build the submarine, but did express some, interest in buying one or two for themselves. Finland was going to get in on this Viking project. But in 2004, Denmark pulls out of the deal, which kind of collapses this whole shared cost thing, because Sweden and Norway, without Denmark, didn't have enough money, I guess, to fund it. So right then and there, shortly after this happens, the Project Viking is canceled. So A-26 gets canceled a second time under the name Viking. And Finland's like, what about our submarine? But they didn't want to, pitch in the design costs. They were going to purchase one, but they weren't going to help pay for the design. And so the project sits dormant again in the early 2000s. So let's fast forward a couple years to 2010. So Kockums, which is the name of the company that runs the shipyard, and it's owned by Sweden. It's kind of a nationalized situation over there. They announce a new next generation of submarine that looks suspiciously a hell of a lot like the A-26 from the 1990s. And the idea is our old Sondermanland class, which is older than the Gotland class, is getting really old. Like, it's getting to the point where it's not safe to go to sea anymore on this very old diesel boat. We've got to build a replacement. So now we have a whole new justification for this A-26 class. Not that it's going to fight the Soviets and be Whamadine. We just need submarines to replace the ones we're about to retire. So that's the new motivation for this. So they announced construction's going to begin in 2012. In just 2 short years, we're going to get this thing going. But The reality is, even though they made all these announcements in 2010, things like elections happen, people at the top of governments get changed out, motivations change politically, which funds the military, and these submarines were never funded. They were lauded, they were talked about, but the dirty little secret is nobody wanted to pay for them because, you know, building submarines doesn't buy you votes, you know. And so they just never had money. So construction never started. And something happens in like 2010 to 2014 where Cuckoms basically doesn't have any money. They can't even begin designing the process without immediate cash influx. And a German huge defense industry company called ThyssenKrupp, which has like 167 sub departments and companies. This ThyssenKrupp group is enormous, but part of it is called ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems AB. And for the life of me, I couldn't find what AB stands for, but ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems buys Cuckoms because Cuckoms has no money. They're just floundering. And so now ThyssenKrupp Marine is the controlling management of this Swedish controlled company. And that gets really hairy, how two different companies that are both controlled by their respective governments, one being Germany and one being Sweden, are now managing control of the shipyard. And that's really hairy. One of the first things that ThyssenKrupp does is cancel the project. There's like, this project has no money. How can we even do this? So they cancel it a third time. 2014, A26 gets canceled again. And the big thing here, it's canceled by a German-controlled management. And that is not cool with anybody in Sweden, especially if you're trying to get reelected. So in comes Saab. Saab is going to negotiate with ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, specifically that part of ThyssenKrupp, about an agreement to acquire the Cuckoms technical designs for the A26 that have been around since the 90s and operations in the Swedish located shipyards of Musco and Malmo. Malmo is more of a design place, but in Musco is where these, I believe, are going to be built. It's one of the places that they wanted to build them anyway. It's not the place that they end up being built, I don't believe. We're going to talk about where these are being built now in just a minute. The reason why I'm hedging my bets on Musco is because Musco may be like the greater region, and where they're being built is a very specific name, but it's in the same place. Again, we'll get to that in just a second. So, but in order for Saab to even complete an agreement with any other company, they need to go through the Swedish Competition Authority approval to make sure that no one company has a monopoly on building submarines, ships, warships, even if that company is a Swedish company. So, so the Swedish Competition Authority needs all the filings. They need all the paperwork. What's the sale going to be? What's the total cost? Who's going to control what at the end of this agreement? And ThyssenKrupp, even though they went public and on television and said, we have a handshake agreement with Saab now, they never produced any paperwork for approval to the Swedish Competition Authority. So this is where things get really hairy, is the Swedish government then steps in and says, because you failed to produce the required documents, Sweden is going to repossess all equipment, which is already located in Sweden anyway. These are Swedish dry docks and shipyards, and all the technical documents in the design office. And we're just going to take it, and you're going to stick to this deal that, even though it doesn't have this competition authority approval yet, this deal is going to happen. And there are two sides to this story that I'm telling you just one of, kind of the Swedish side. The German side says that they didn't have time to get all the paperwork together and that it was in process. So know that if you tried to research this like I did, there are many different versions of what's happening here. And there are no clear winners. And I believe that because each side has their own story to kind of defend themselves, the truth is lost. We don't really know what the truth is. But we just know this was a business deal gone bad, announced too early, never was approved, resulting in government officials going to a shipyard and, taking documents out of a building to take back to Sweden or Stockholm or wherever, but taking physical control of these technical documents. And the management that's in these buildings inside the country of Sweden are German workers, right? Now they're Swedish people, but they're paid by Germany, and they lock the doors. This becomes a hostage situation. They lock the officials coming to take the technical documents. They shut the gates so they can't drive back out of the shipyard again with the technical documents. It's a huge kerfuffle. Like, this is almost going to become a big international incident between Germany and Sweden over this agreement that's falling apart. It's a mess. And again, there's 4 different versions of this. And I'm just, again, trying to tell you 2 of them, Germany and Sweden. The workers say that never happened. Germany says they never locked any doors. Sweden says you wouldn't let us leave with our documents. So all that stuff is out there. Which one is true? I leave that up to you. But it's a mess. But what this does do is it accelerates the conclusion of this financial process so that they avoid an international incident. And within a few months, by June of 2014, that same year that all this is going down, this, by the way, if I didn't say it, this began in February 2014. The locking of the doors and the hostage situation was in April, right? And by June, so by May and then June, they finally have an agreement reached for 340 million Swedish kroner to finish the deal. And Saab is now taking control and operations of the shipyard. And they have all the technical documents. Now, as this June 29th, 2014 on the screen announcement says, that the purchase price was 340 million SEK. And the acquisition is in line with Saab's ambition to increase its capability with the naval domain, or in the naval domain. But this was a really big deal in 2014, if anyone was paying attention back then. And again, there's a lot of different versions as to what really happened. And I couldn't sift through all the BS to figure out what was the truth and what wasn't. A lot of different versions. But in 2015, Sweden has control of their shipyards again. And so they re-announce for the 4th time that there will be an A-26. They attach the Blekinge class name to it, and they're going to pay for 2 of these submarines. It's an $8 billion SEK purchase for one of these, and they're going to build 2. Again, it's intended to replace the Sonarman class, and that Gotland class is starting to get pretty old as well. So it will probably eventually replace the Gotland class if they ever get these things built. But just know that in 2015, the purpose is to replace the very old, aging Sonarman class conventionally powered submarines. Unlike the Submarine class, this one is designed top rate in deep water and in shallow water, this A-26 design. It's going to be air independent power. Technically it's air independent propulsion, but the AIP crowd keeps going back and forth on what that definition means. And for the A-26, it technically means air independent propulsion because the Stirling style engine that they have in the Gotland and the new version of the Stirling that they're putting in the A-26 is basically an 18th century design of a heat exchanging engine where you have a cylinder. The top end of the cylinder is hot. The bottom end of the cylinder is cold, and the piston oscillates between the hot and the cold side. And the hotter the hot is and the cold is, the faster the piston goes. That is not a new design. That's one of the first entries into engines. It's one of the first engines ever built. Is the Stirling style of engine. One of the nice things about it is that once you get it going, it's very efficient. You just got to keep the hot hot and the cold cold. And you want to change speeds, you make it hotter and the colder colder. You want to slow down, you bring them a little bit closer together. Very cool design. And that's what's powering the Gotland right now. It's been doing it since the 1990s. And that's what's going to power the A-26. But they, of course, have a 2015 version of it, right? It's an updated version, more efficient. Okay, so besides that magical engine that's really efficient, they're also going to support special operations, and it's also very quiet. One of the reasons why the United States used the Gatling class as a test target off the coast of San Diego for 2 years, 2004, 2005, I believe it was, is because of how quiet she was. She makes a great target. She sank our carrier in war games multiple times during those 2 years. So they're very good. Now, one of the things that makes the Gatling and this A-26 very quiet is whenever they build the hull and all the heavy pieces of framework that are going to be modularly inserted into the hull that we're about to get to, is they blend the steel with sound absorbing material. The way they do that is still proprietary, and because it's a military project, it's also secret. So it's not public. We can't really talk about how that happens. But imagine if you had some hard steel that could, keep your submarine safe at 300 meters or 900 some feet, and it was also a little bit flexible, so any sound you made inside the submarine got to the steel and then went through a layer that was kind of soft, so the energy was absorbed. But then it got hard again to keep the water out, but then it got soft again. Oh, but the water's going to come in, so make it hard again. And then you have this layering that I'm not describing to you in any detail of how this steel on this submarine is special to keep the water out and the sound in. Okay, so the Blekinge design by the numbers, it's 2,000-ton submarine, and that varies. There are at least 3 versions of this submarine, but they're only building one right now. It is 65 meters long, 6.4 meters of beam, diesel electric with a Stirling AIP engine that we described for you. It can be at sea for 18 days submerged, and that is pretty good. That shows the power of this Stirling air-independent propulsion system, where it can run with just internal, sources for up to 18 days. Now, it can stay at sea to 45 days, but that requires going to the surface, regenerating some of the diesel battery, and of course the air for the crew. I'm sure they would appreciate some nice air after 18 days being submerged. The crew size is very small. 26 people. I thought this was a typo when I first read it, but I have it from multiple sources that the export version of this submarine is going to have a 26-man crew. Yeah, that's really how they do that. Well, the way they did that is they made everything automated, much like the Alpha, where you can operate everything, including the torpedo room, from the control room, is how this is set up. So if you want to change speed, you may have a watchstander in the engine room just to make sure everything's operating back there. But the person that actually controls the throttles is in the control room. So you don't have a maneuvering per se in the traditional sense back in the engine room with a steam man on the throttles. That would be a different propulsion anyway. But my example is that the throttle room watchstanders are not, the maneuvering room watchstanders are not necessary for this kind of design. And this is a very modern way to submarine. And a lot of submarines are going to this format where you want to reduce the crew. Because why? Why on a submarine is it important to have a few crew members as possible? Because especially in the nuclear world, the only thing limiting you from being eternally at sea is the damn humans on board, because they suck up all the food, they drink all the water, they breathe all the air. If you didn't have to have that, you wouldn't have to have your submarine come back except for maintenance. So if you want your submarine to stay at sea for a long period of time, you don't want it to be food limited. And the more people you have eating food, the less time at sea you have, unless you want to make your submarine bigger to store more food for the people. So being at sea for 45 days is only possible because it has a 26-man core crew. And then, of course, up to 10 men special ops with that, because they support special ops, as you see here in the picture. So highly automated systems, and they have 4 53-centimeter torpedo tubes. I don't know why, but all over the internet, they have 6 torpedo tubes for the Blekinge. That is not the case. It's 4 torpedo tubes. I'm about to show you a picture of it in the next slide here. So don't believe a lot of the stuff you're reading on public websites, because they're incorrect on this class of submarine. And maybe that's because the submarine's been around for 4 decades, 3 decades, and maybe at one point they had more torpedo tubes. But in the 2022 version, they got 4 torpedo tubes, okay? Trust me on this one. All right, so For September 2015, they begin cutting steel on this thing. You know, they got the $8 billion check. They're going to start building Hull 1 in Karlskrona. Karlskrona is where the shipyard is actually at. So Karlskrona is where they're building A6 Hull 1. The design phase is declared ended, and they're moving into the production phase. And this is a bit of pomp and circumstance and not really the truth. The reason why they're saying the design phase is ended is because that's a milestone to where they can go to international buyers and say, hey, we have this A26 submarine and we have some different variants of it. Would you be interested in buying one? And they're going to subsidize the cost of building Hull 1, which they already know in 2015 is going to cost more than 8 billion Swedish kroner with the sales of these A26 abroad, right? Nobody's buying them. Nobody's subsidizing Hull 1. It's been 7 years and no one's interested. One of the countries that was a little bit interested was Australia. If you remember the Aussie deal that ended up going to Naval Group, right? And that all fell apart because now it's AUKUS, right? And they're going to get nuclear submarines instead. Well, one of the 3 or 4 submarines that they were looking at was this A26. And that deal did not happen. But this submarine is still for sale on the international market if you would like to buy one. And I'll show you all the different variants that you can get. So Sweden's looking for international purchasers. The designs are not complete. That's the big thing. What is complete is the outer hull. They know the diameter and they can begin cutting steel and putting hull sections together. What was not complete in 2015 were all the different modules. These are the modules here. And there's more than this. These are the ones that were unclassified that I can find pictures of. But there's a lot more than this. But here's the big thing. Look at this. This is the torpedo room right here. So with the Special Forces Operations module installed in the torpedo room, you get what looks like a 5th torpedo tube that's a little bit bigger in the center than the other ones. That is actually a diving submersible lockout. So you can have divers in there. They got a little mini submarine, and it had to be bigger to fit the mini submarine and all the extra divers. Okay, so that's why you got a 5th tube in the bow center line going forward. That's not for torpedoes. That's for people, divers, and whatnot. So what else do they have here? They have another diver lockout. Oh, this is like a side view of what this tube is right here. And this is a picture of the submarine in the tube there. So you can come in, like if you had the module back here and not in the torpedo room, you could come up into it from the bottom. And H.I. Sutton has a great cutaway drawing of this that we're going to get to here in the end of at the end of the brief. So if you don't want to have the mini sub in the torpedo room like they have it here because you want your torpedoes in the torpedo room, you can put a multi-purpose module back by the engine room that has the dock back there for the mini sub, and of course lock out the divers as well. But here you go. So you have options in the torpedo room or not in the torpedo room. Here's a picture of the mini sub we're talking about. This is the one that Saab designed and they actually use, is this yellow one here. Yep. H.I. Sutton had this as an example. I'm not sure if this is this is definitely a different model, but it looks like this one here. Yeah, that this diver is actually using. So again, credit to H.I. Sutton for these photos, by the way. I got these off his website, Covert Shores. You definitely want to check that out if you haven't gone to Covert Shores. He talks about all these submarines in detail, not just the Blekinge class. But here you go. Lots of propulsion. Why do they need so many motors on ones? Because it's carrying a lot of gear and divers hanging onto the side. It's not just the driver. You know, you're going to have, like with the American Special Forces, there's little handles that are along the side here that the divers, they can just kind of put their arms in and be carried along, you know, so they don't have to exert themselves swimming for miles. Anyway, so this is what's in those dry docks. This looks like this could be in the torpedo room here. When I say dry docks, I'm talking about lockout chambers. Yep. All right. So what goes in the torpedo room? What kind of torpedo does this thing shoot when it's not shooting Special Forces out torpedo tubes? The Saab torpedo 6.2 heavyweight torpedo, very much like the American ADCAP. Really, it's 40 plus knots. It probably does 55 plus, but the unclassified numbers are 40 plus. 40 nautical range, probably a lot more than that. Well, no, I take that. Not. It's probably close to 40 nautical miles because that's a long ways. That's like 80,000 yards. So very long range torpedo. Wire guided. It's certainly not wire guided for 40 miles. That's not even possible, but it's certainly wire guided for a for part of that. It can track and classify targets on its own. And the big thing about that is it can identify countermeasures. And if you have a weapon that can on its own identify a countermeasure, you're, leaps and bounds ahead of 90% of other navies out there. And the Americans have that capability. The UK has it because I've seen it myself. It's terrifying. And the Swedish have it as well. I suspect the Germans have it with theirs, but they're not very they're not very talkative about how good their weapons are. They just want to sell them to you. Maybe the Germans have them. The Russians claim to have them, as do the Chinese. I have no idea one way or the other. Those countries claim so much, that's not true. It's insane. But I can tell you what, NATO countries have this capability, and it's awesome. The nice thing about it being able to tell a countermeasure is it can basically ignore that countermeasure and go after the target. Yeah, and I've been that target down in the Bahamas a few times. That's a lot of fun. So something Sweden is known for, they're not the only country to do this, but they're certainly the one that does it the best, in my opinion. They're very good at this, is inside those 53 centimeter torpedo tubes that are very long. Instead of putting a 53 centimeter torpedo in there like you would a normal country would do, they like to put two back-to-back 40 centimeter torpedoes that have a little sabot around them so they don't rattle around in there, and swim out essentially two torpedoes that are wire guided from one torpedo tube. Yeah. So in the case of the A-26, they could have, 8 torpedoes out at once, controlling them with their fire control system that's more than capable of doing it, and be supporting, special operations at the same time. And something else that Sweden is fooling around with is not just launching torpedoes in tandem. Drones, UUVs, are the new thing. The A-26, since in the last 24 months, has added a new capability where they can support unmanned underwater vehicles as sensors, mobile sonar systems, things that we in the 90s just dreamed about and were literally in science fiction shows, is able to be done by this A-26 when it's complete. That's a big caveat because, as you'll see, she's not as far along as we thought. But the design is there. The technology is there. They just need to build it now. So they can tandem launch, and they do, by the way, tandem launch these 40 centimeter torpedoes, and the new hotness is unmanned underwater vehicles that can be retrieved autonomously, wire guided, around the submarine. One of the tactics that we expect them to use is to have one sensor that's unmanned vehicle out a few thousand yards away from the submarine, projecting active sonar. And so whenever you hear the active sonar bearing on your submarine or ship or sonar buoy, the bearing you're getting to the active is not the bearing of the submarine. So if you shoot the active itself, you're not going to hit the submarine likely if they put it far enough away. Again, tactics. But that's one way that submarines can begin using active sonar again in a way that doesn't immediately give away their position. That's coming. Okay, A-26 variants. I've been promising you this for a while, so here we are. So the A-26 is a baseline submarine. The crew of 26 people, 10 special ops if they're on board, at sea 45 days. That's baseline. That's what we're talking about. Now, from that, there is a version called the Oceanic ER. That's extended range. So this is 1,000 tons heavier for 3,000 tons total. It is a long-range submarine, crew of 50. This is similar to what a country like Australia would need, even though this is not the exact one that they were offered, where you want your submarine to be able to transit the Pacific Ocean. So if you're a nation over, in the Pacific region, and for some reason you wanted to go back and forth in your conventionally powered submarine without needing to refuel at sea, you could use this oceanic extended range version. It would cost you a few more people, but you could make those long transits safely without risk of running out of fuel for whatever reason. So there's also the A-26 Oceanic in quotes, export version, which is the baseline model. This has a crew of 35 people. So That may include the special ops, but it's basically the same baseline model that they're using for Sweden with a little bit less capability. And that the less capability thing is ambiguous. They're not clear on that. That's not public. I'm sure if you had billions of dollars to buy one, they would probably tell you the difference. But it's not public exactly what the difference between the export version is and the baseline is, other than there is small differences. One of which looks like to be the crew complement is 10 more. But that could also be, like I said, the special operations. Okay, finally, the A-26 Pelagic is a smaller 1,000-ton submarine. This is a tiny little submarine, 1,000 tons. But it's also less expensive and only has a crew of 25 and is designed for, shallow water littoral operations only. You're not going very far in this version of the submarine. So if you have a coastline that you want to defend, say Norway would be a great use for the submarine that has fjords, deep water, jagged archipelago-like coastline anyway, the fjord-like coastline. This would be a great submarine to sit there and be like a gatekeeper going into a fjord. Or if you're a small nation and can't afford expensive submarines, but say like in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, this would be great for them as well. They don't need to go very far. They just need people off the coast keeping an eye on things. And that's what the submarine is for. Now, the Type 612, this is the one that was offered to Australia. It's now 7 years later since that deal began, and we know now that it's fallen apart. But at the time, they called it the Type 612, and it was a 4,000-ton oceanic extended range submarine. So it was like an even bigger version of the Oceanic ER. And again, Australia decided to not go with that for whatever reason. They ended up going with Naval Group. The Type 612 was also offered to Poland. This has been on the table for Poland for at least 6 years. And I believe it's still on the table now for their Orca program. Now, I'm not that familiar with the Polish Orca program, other than it involves buying a submarine, at least one, if not a few more. There's probably more to that program than just that. But for cost reasons, Poland has been pushing off, not canceling, not even really suspending, but just delaying this Orca program for years and years. And maybe if you guys have enough interest in it and you want me to research the Orca program, maybe we'll do something like that. But just know that the Type 612 still exists as a design on paper. It's a big submarine, 4,000 tons for a diesel boat. That doesn't, and Poland may end up getting it. It's not, in my opinion, the best of these designs for Poland's. Poland's coastline is extremely important to Poland, absolutely, but it's also not that big, so they don't need the long range unless they plan on visiting Canada or something. They certainly don't need that. And there is a VLS module. Remember, this is a modular submarine, so they have all these different bits and pieces that they can plug in. One of them is a VLS module that has 18 tubes, vertical tubes, that can shoot things like Tomahawk cruise missiles and whatnot. Again, that is a module that's available to countries, and they have not. But as of now, only one is being built, and it's being built for Sweden, and that one does not have the VLS on that particular hull 1. Okay, so I told you the A-26 was being built in Karlskrona shipyard in Sweden. There's the red marker for it. It's pretty close to the other place I told you at the beginning of the stream here. But I don't know if it's the exact location, so that's why I said it's just Karlskrona shipyard. It looks like it might be in the same city, but I'm not 100%. But they are integrating, like I said, underwater unmanned vehicles are going to be in Hull 1, and we'll see what they do with that. And they're going to be using UUVs as active sensors, which I think will be a first, publicly anyway, of any submarine using a remote vehicle as an active sensor. Passive sensors been done in the past, but using it as active is different, because that requires a tether. It requires power, a lot of power to transmit active. You're not sending a battery out there unless it's a really good battery. We'll see what they do. And then here's the bombshell. It's expected to be completed in 2027. And this is 2 years later than what they had originally announced in 2019. As early as 2019, they thought these would be done by 2025. Now, what has happened between 2019 and 2022? Well, there was a pandemic, and that's probably the reason for the delay. But I know for a fact that part of the budgeting for even Hull 1 was to be subsidized by the sale of these submarines. And no one is buying them. No one is. Their best chance to sell one was to Australia. And that deal was gone in like 2016, 2017. Yeah, they didn't have any chance of that. But they're forging on because they need to replace their older submarines. And this is the submarine that's going to do it. This one. This is H.I. Sutton's drawing. Again, credit to him. Go to hisutton.com for his version, because he has a whole article on this submarine. A few years old, but still applies. And so what he's done here is he's kind of plugged in some of the modules that are available. This is not the submarine that's being built right now. This is not Hull 1. But this is what could be done with the seal-carrying submarine behind the VLS module, which is behind the crew berthing and the engine room, the regeneration tank. That's part of the Stirling engine thing. You have this is not a lockout chamber. This is a escape hatch. But the Stirling engines are back here. The lockout chamber that leads into the, where the submarine would be back here. In the module that they have now, this is not open. The submarine does not come out the top like this. It slides out the back. And up here in the torpedo room here in the front, you still have, the big lockout chamber. This one is center line. It's not on the edge like it is in this drawing. Oh, it just appears to be on the edge. It's not. It's center line in the drawing as well. But here he has the right number of torpedo tubes. Again, this drawing is a few years old, so H.I. Sutton had to take a few guesses, and he guessed right because he's knowledgeable about the lockout chambers. There is a lockout chamber by the sail where special forces can go in and out. And the big thing is, if you look carefully, you can see there's like a main deck right here that runs along. And this is where the modules will sit. So inside the submarine hull that's round, obviously, there is the bottom part of the round hull. That's the bilge, right? And there's going to be some things that are above the bilge in the outboards, much like this liquid oxygen tank here for the Stirling engines. But above that, there's a flat deck. And on that flat deck, which is like the main deck, is where a lot of this equipment is going to sit, whether it's a torpedo tube or a command center or a Stirling air independent power engine. It's going to sit on that main deck. And so you have a lot of overhead over that to put these big things. And unlike, nuclear submarines, they don't need 3 decks. They can get away with having just one main deck inside the submarine. Because remember, it's very small. It's very automated. Everything is controlled by the control center, essentially. You still got to have someone making your foods and stuff like that. You still got to have watchstanders. But this is a very automated submarine. And this is a great drawing, and that's why I included it in this brief. And so this is the A-26, and I'm going to keep tabs on this as it goes through its production. If anything new comes up, I'll probably throw it up on the Discord where you'll see updates. It wouldn't be worthy of making a whole nother video about. But maybe after they commission it, maybe we'll see what they actually built. Because this thing is a bit like the Virginia, where they can build all sorts of different variants with different capabilities. But one thing we do know, based on what they've done with the Gotland class, no matter what they put on the submarine, it's going to be quiet, because they have a special manufacturing technique that absorbs sound before it ever gets to the water. And it's quite brilliant. Engineering-wise, it's just brilliant. And they're holding that close. It's not public. They don't want other companies building quiet submarines as well as they do. All right. I think now we're going to go ahead and shift into the Q&A portion. I see a bunch of people talking in chat. I hope you're not pointing out mistakes or anything. That would be terrible for me. But I do want to say thanks to the Patreons. If you